Prep-RNA extraction kit is intended for DNA-RNA purification from biological material for further analysis with reverse transcription and polymerase chain reaction. The kit contains lysis buffer, precipitation buffer, washout solution number 1, washout solution number 2, dilution buffer, negative control C-, internal control RNA IC, internal control DNA IC. Negative control, internal control RNA IC, and internal control DNA IC from Prep-RNA kit are not used in this method. Instead, internal control RNA IC from Sars CoV2 SARS-CoV kit is used. For RNA extraction, only Prep-RNA kit can be used. Prep-RNA Plus kit is intended for DNA extraction and cannot be used for the extraction of RNA. The kit is capable of nucleic acid extraction from 100 samples, including negative control samples. Biomaterial for testing: swabs from nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal cavity, bronchopulmonary lavage, endotracheal and nasopharyngeal aspirate, and phlegm. For swabs from nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal cavity, it is recommended to use transport medium for biomaterial including viral RNA. For example, transport medium STOR-F by DNA Technology. Viral load can vary broadly from very low in the biomaterial from asymptomatic carriers and recovering patients to very high in the biomaterial from patients with acute pneumonia. Hence, there is a risk of cross-contamination between samples on all steps of work. To prevent cross-contamination in the laboratory, it is recommended to follow some rules. It is necessary to visually estimate all biomaterial and condemn all samples if there is some tubes with disrupted leak-proofness. As far as possible, high-copy samples should be separated in an individual stream, particularly from patients with symptoms of severe infection. It is recommended to work with high-load samples in a separate box. It is necessary to carry out negative controls in each protocol starting from the step of RNA extraction. Aerosol barrier pipette tips should be used. Tubes should be opened by tweezers or a special device. Avoid touching by glove the inner surface of the tube. Change the tip after each manipulation. RNA extraction should be undertaken in the second or third safety class box. The lysis buffer can form precipitate. Dissolve it at 65 Celsius for 10 minutes prior to use. Mark the required number of 1.5 ml tubes, considering the number of samples to be tested and negative control, C-. Vortex RNA AC from Sars CoV2 SARS-CoV kit and spin down the drops using the counterweight. Add 10 microliters of premixed internal control RNA IC from the Sars CoV2 SARS-CoV kit to each marked tube. The usage of RNA IC from Prep-RNA kit is not allowed. Add 300 microliters of the lysis buffer into each tube, avoiding contact of the pipette tip with the edge of the tube. Close the tubes. Attention! During the preparation of swabs from nasopharynx and oropharynx taken in the tubes with the transport medium, preliminary centrifugation is not required. It is enough to shake the tubes and precipitate drops from the tube lids on a vortex centrifuge. Add 100 microliters of the sample into the marked tubes, except C- tube. In the C- tube, add 100 microliters of sterile saline. Close the tubes tightly and vortex them for 3-4 seconds. Spin down the drops on vortex for 1-3 seconds. Incubate the tubes for 15 minutes at 65 Celsius. Spin down the drops at 13,000 rpm for 30 seconds. Add 400 microliters of the precipitation buffer, changing the tip after each sample. Close the tubes tightly and vortex them for 3-5 seconds. Centrifuge the tubes at 13,000 rpm for 15 minutes. It is recommended to put each tube in the centrifuge in the same manner, for example with lid tails looking outside, to simplify manipulations with the precipitate. Remove supernatant completely, avoiding contact of the pipette tip with the precipitate. Use new tip for each sample. Add 500 microliters of the washout solution number 1 to the precipitate, changing the tip after each sample. Mix gently by inverting the tube 3-5 times. Centrifuge the tube at 13,000 rpm for 5 minutes. Remove supernatant completely, avoiding contact of the pipette tip with the precipitate. Use new tip for each sample. Add 300 microliters of the washout solution number 2 to the precipitate. It is recommended to moisten the tip with the solution before working. Use new tip for each sample. Mix the tubes by inverting them 3-5 times. Centrifuge the tube at 13,000 rpm for 5 minutes. Remove supernatant completely, avoiding contact of the pipette tip with the precipitate. Use new tip for each sample. Open the tubes and dry the precipitate at 65 Celsius for 5 minutes. Add 50 microliters dilution buffer to the pellet. Close the tubes. Spin down the drops by centrifuging for 1-3 seconds. Incubate the tubes for 10 minutes at 65 Celsius. Vortex the tubes for 3-5 seconds. Centrifuge the tube at 13,000 rpm for 30 seconds. The obtained RNA must be used immediately for reverse transcription reaction. For repeated testing, it is necessary to immediately put remaining RNA into a freezing chamber and store at the temperatures up to 18 Celsius no longer than 7 days without unfreezing.